All right, Andy Weber is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense, and he is now with the Council on Strategic Risks. And John Gower is a retired Rear Admiral and was the Assistant Chief of Defense Staff for Nuclear and Chemical Biological in the UK Ministry of Defense, the MOD, and he is also a Senior Advisor with the Council on Strategic Risks. Hello to both of you.
Hello, Dana.
Firstly, if I can just start with, we're watching this horrific, very bloody assault on Ukraine, and I'm hearing voices like, former opposition figure Garry Kasparov challenging NATO's decision not to enter combat in Ukraine, questioning Putin's bluff on nuclear weapons, saying that the West has withered from President Putin's threats. Now, both of you have a lot of experience in terms of what the dire consequences would be if we got into a showdown with Russia and one that escalates out of our control. Can you address the great reticence now in the West and the prolonged questioning of why NATO is not putting boots on the ground or putting in a no-fly zone? Let's start with you, Andy.
Well, President Biden has been clear that we don't want to have direct combat with Russian forces, even in or over the territory of Ukraine, because that could escalate, in his words, to World War III. However, if Russia does escalate to the use of chemical or biological weapons, as seems possible based on recent intelligence that has been made public by the United Kingdom and the United States, we would reassess that position.
What intelligence is that? I mean, you're talking about the statements of Jens Stoltenberg from NATO saying that Russia could use chemical weapons in Ukraine. Is that what you're referring to?
No, I'm talking about recent intelligence that the UK Defense Secretary released, saying that Russia is planning for a false flag chemical or biological weapons attack in Ukraine. That was released yesterday.
All right, John, do you want to just, address this? Do you think that we are over emphasizing and we are too worried about the use of non-conventional weapons by Russia, and that Putin is just using that to flatten Ukraine while he intimidates the West?
No, there's ample evidence of Putin's personal use of these weapons as assassination tools. He has, or the Soviet Union and Russia before and during his time, has attempted 3 assassinations, one with a biological weapon, which was successful in the 1980s, one with a radiological source, which killed Litvinenko, and the attempted assassination of the Skripal family in Salisbury recently. So his personal predilection for these awful weapons of destruction at the individual level is proven. He's also, in recent past, covered and assisted Assad, president of Syria, in his use of essentially the weapons program that was derived from the Russian program in the civil war in Syria. So his fingers are all over these weapons. We've seen him use chemical agents internally against his own people to break sieges and so-called terrorist activities. And there's very good intelligence that he used these weapons in the very similar brutal repression of Chechnya some years ago. So I think to assume anything else, that he is absolutely ready to do this, would be extremely foolish. And as the Defense Secretary made very clear, and other reports have, and has been throughout this brutal campaign against Ukraine, misinformation, both internally and externally, has been a major part of this.
So help us navigate that misinformation, and maybe I can ask Andy on that, because it is the Russians, including the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who has said that the West and the US are running labs in Ukraine, and that the West would use chemical weapons.
Yeah, I would just add to what Admiral Gower said, that although Putin has threatened the use of nuclear weapons, I think it's much more likely that he would use chemical and or biological weapons in Ukraine. And we've responded to his nuclear threats with appropriate restraint. We don't want to allow this crisis to escalate to nuclear. But the Russian disinformation campaign, which is not new, although it has amped up significantly in recent weeks and days, and is being parroted by China, these ludicrous charges that the United States is supporting biological weapons work in Ukraine. Everyone knows that the United States ended its biological weapons program by order of President Nixon in 1969, and that Ukraine has never had a biological weapons program or a chemical weapons program. It's the Russians who've been in violation of both the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention ever since the Soviet Union broke up. And they have three secret laboratories, military biological laboratories inside Russia that are part of their biological weapons program that have never been visited by foreign observers or inspectors. So they're deflecting blame, and it looks like they're preparing the ground to use these horrible weapons and blame it on the United States and Ukraine.
What weapons? I mean, what are they producing? What do you suspect is going on in those labs? And what would they potentially use in Ukraine? And you're saying it's likely now, not that there's a danger.
I'm saying it's more likely, and apparently we have intelligence to back up that they're planning this. It's more likely than using nuclear weapons. They do have a range of chemical weapons they can use, everything from industrial chemicals like chlorine to sarin, VX, and Novichok, a fourth generation agent that they used in Salisbury. And biological weapons, they're most likely to use something that is not contagious human to human, something like anthrax.
And I think, if I may add to what Andy said,
Please.
The purpose of their false flagging, their misinformation campaign is twofold. Firstly, to provide a context behind which they can manufacture both internally and externally a rationale for these weapons, but also, as we saw in Syria, and as we have seen in the conventional end here, to blame those releases not on themselves, but on a failed attack or an inaccurate self problem from the so-called Ukrainian program that they have said is in existence. So this is twofold. It is pre-deflecting blame, but it is also providing the narrative which internally allows Putin to pass an order to his generals to do this, because of course Vladimir Putin's finger will not be on the launch button. And whilst it is right that everybody is pointing to the president for all of the ills in Ukraine, it is important to maintain that everybody under the chain of command, down to the commander, down to the private who is launching the artilleries at civilians today, who conducted the attack on the nuclear power generation plant in direct violation of one of the laws of armed combat, that should not take place. And every soldier and officer in the command chain who is part of an order to release chemical or biological weapons is individually responsible and will be found and tried ultimately in an international court. These are crimes against the law of armed conflict and against every convention which Russia has incidentally signed up to. And as Andy has clearly said, is in continuous violation thereof.
Why would Russia use chemical or biological weapons in the war in Ukraine? Andy?
Well, because they are weapons of terror. They are primarily weapons of terror because it is, I mean, you end up as dead as if you're hit by an artillery shell, but they have an extremely high level of terror for the population because you do not know, you do not hear them, you do not see them, and they kill in an atrociously awful way. And you watch people dying in a way that is infinitely worse. So for a start, they're very lethal, but they are particularly aimed at the terrorizing of civilians, and civilians in particular, because they have no protection against these weapons. the strange thing about using these weapons is, in fact, the people against which it is in any war, any proper war, legitimate for you to attack, the armed forces, are those that are protected against these weapons. So they are predominantly civilian killers and terrorizing weapons.
Andy, why would
I would
they?
add, yes, another reason I think they might use them is desperation. The vaunted Russian military is performing badly in combat in Ukraine, and they're increasingly desperate. So this would increase the chances that they'll reach for these horrific weapons of mass destruction, either chemical or biological, to try to turn the war around, which isn't going well for President Putin. He badly miscalculated with this reckless, unprovoked attack.
Why is the US funding labs in Ukraine? How many are there and what is in them?
Oh, I've been to all of the biological laboratories in Ukraine that the United States has supported since 2005. In fact, I helped create that program, and it's aimed at improving Ukraine Ministry of Health capabilities to detect, diagnose, and respond to infectious disease outbreaks, and the Ministry of Agriculture to respond to animal disease outbreaks. This is part of a system to strengthen early warning for disease outbreaks so we can prevent pandemics before they spread around the world. And I'm very proud of the work we've been doing in partnership with Ukraine in this area with their public health system. And it's proved invaluable during COVID for Ukrainian public health.
One of the questions was, do any of these labs have dangerous materials still in them? And should they be destroyed? And if they are dangerous, why was the US helping Ukraine research and store that kind of material?
Well, first of all, I support the World Health Organization's suggestion that in anticipation of Russian attacks, that the culture collections in these laboratories should be destroyed to prevent a release into the environment or misuse by the Russian army. Some of them do contain samples of dangerous endemic diseases that are circulating in Ukraine, and it's legitimate peaceful research to study and understand these diseases. But with the possibility of Russian bombing or direct attacks on these facilities, I would strongly hope that they're destroying their pathogen collections, which is fairly easy to do using either thermal treatment or essentially bleach.
I think it's important to add to that, Dana, that there isn't a country in Europe whose health organizations are not conducting this research in laboratories of their own and laboratories funded by the European Union or partially funded by the European Union. The only difference is none of those countries are under brutal attack from the air and from the land. And so, like Andy, the WHO I agree, the WHO has made a prudent request of the Ukrainian government that while it is under this brutal attack, it takes the precaution of destroying the small amounts of pathogens that are necessary for this research, and equally small amounts of pathogens endemic in the countries around the world that conduct this research. This is not simply Ukraine. Everyone does it. The Russians do it as well.